I'm going to be sharing a project that I worked on during my fellowship at the North Carolina Injury and Violence Prevention Branch, looking at violent death rates by occupational group in the state. So Ethan kind of touched on this a little bit about how we're compiling information in the North Carolina Violent Death Reporting System, which is similar to Colorado. We get information from various data sources. Two elements that we collect but have not done a lot with are the industry and occupation of the victim of violent death. These are free text fields, and sometimes that poses some various challenges with analyzing those data. In 2016, this MMWR came out from some researchers at CDC who looked at the suicide rates within the National Violent Death Reporting System by occupational group. And what they found is that there were differences. Individuals that were in farming, fishing, and forestry occupational groups had higher rates of suicide overall and among males. And for females, it was in service industries. So this is something we sought out to replicate. The way that they did this is they used the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, has a coding system called NIOX that assigns codes for industry and occupation. The standard occupational classification codes are what they used in the MMWR, and this is what we also used for analysis with the North Carolina Violent Death Reporting System data. And so how these are set up is there are 23 major groups or occupational groups, such as management, which would be some of your high-level executives or PR representatives and the like, all the way down to like legal occupations, which would be lawyers and judges, some service occupations, which would be some people like home visitors and stuff like that. So they all kind of fall into these major occupational groups. And then that's captured in the first two digits of the code. And then if you click on one of these groups, I'll do the farming, fishing, and forestry, for example, the subsequent digits of the code get into more detail to allow for deeper dives into those occupational groups. So we wanted to test this out to see how our data were auto-coded by the system. So we started with just 1 year's worth of data. In 2014, there were 1,500 violent deaths in the state that we uploaded the free text fields for industry and occupation into the NIOX system. And the way the system works is it uses both the industry and occupation fields together to assign either a NAICS code for industry or a SOC code or both. And so the proportions I have here are just for the SOC codes. It was closer to 80% overall. We tested it at both the high confidence level and the medium confidence level. And we felt comfortable after reviewing how these were coded with going with the medium confidence level, since it gave a higher return on auto coding, and assigned those SOC categories for occupational groups. And then we also looked through all of these and found that there were some categories that were being missed due to how some of the data were captured in the text fields, or because there weren't SOC codes available to categorize those groups. And some of these were groups that we felt would be important to capture for violent death surveillance. So the most common groups were students, homemakers, individuals who were disabled or never worked, self-employed, and military occupations. And I will say the 2018 SOC codes do have a military category now. And so after we manually categorized these groups, as well as some of the ones that were not captured for the SOC codes that do exist, that auto-coding went up to about 88% of groups that fell into an occupation. And so once we found that this was something we could do and have a high proportion of our records that had an occupational group, we replicated it for all years of data available in NC-VDRS. We limited our analysis to those residents so that we could calculate rates in victims that were 16 years of age and older and potentially in the workforce. And then we ran that through the same program that we did with our first 1 year data test to assign some of those categories. And then we looked at some variations in the manner of death and occupation. First, we did it at the major occupational group, those 23 categories I originally showed you, so that we can compare the rates that we saw for suicides to what was found in that original MMWR. And then to do a little bit of cross-cutting, the numbers got a little bit small, so we aggregated to a higher level of groups. There's some guidance documents available on the NIOX website on how these codes can be compiled, and you're able to sort of group them as you see fit for whatever your analysis is and how you're looking at your data. So these were the broader categories that we used when we were looking at the occupational groups by sex, age, and we also looked at urban-rural using the National Center for Health Statistics 2013 urban-rural classification to assign the metro and non-metro classification to our counties. So looking first at the major occupational groups, we had very different results than what we're seeing in the national violent death reporting system. The highest rates for both suicide and homicide, and I will say homicide was not included in the original MMWR, was among construction and extraction occupations. And surprisingly enough, our lowest categories, farming, fishing, and forestry, fell into one of the lowest rates for occupation, or for suicide among occupational groups. And legal was the lowest for both suicide and homicide. And now switching to the broader occupational group, and we did maintain in those additional categories that we had created. We wanted to look by sex, and you could see there was some variation between males and females. Males had higher rates overall and had highest rates in the construction-related types of occupations and maintenance, followed by management and business. Females had highest rates in management and business as well, but the second highest and not far behind was homemakers that had high rates of suicide. By age group, there were also some variations. The management and business that we saw that peaked for both sexes really starts to get high older in the older adult age groups and middle age. Students have an extremely high rate in our youngest age group, and that kind of dips down. That's that yellow line. And one thing that I found interesting was I sort of expected those individuals who are not working to have higher rates overall, and that's the gray line at the bottom here, which has low rates across all age groups. For the urban-rural classification, or metro, non-metro counties, occupational groups had similar rates across the age group with some slight variation, except for the production, transportation, and material moving had much higher rates of suicide in non-metropolitan counties, and that might be related to the types of occupations that are available in those areas. Now looking at homicides, there also were higher rates for men overall and some variation by sex. Males still had highest rates in construction, followed by production, transportation, and material moving. Females had highest rates in service industries, followed by management and business. There was sort of a similar trend to suicide in regards to students, where they had highest rates in the youngest population, and that dipped down, and then similar trends across the other occupational groups. And then for the urban-rural classification, here, again, there were some similarities across each of the occupational groups. However, there was a big variation in the construction, natural resources occupations between metropolitan and non-metro counties, with about 2 times the rate as those in the metropolitan. So overall, we found that the quality of our text fields for industry and occupation were of quality enough to do this auto coding, and with the SAS code that was developed, this is something that we'll continue to incorporate into the NC-VDRS to analyze rates of suicide and homicide by occupational group. The phrases that we identified that were not auto-coded, we're planning on working with our abstractors to address to increase auto-coding in subsequent years. I did mention that military, there are stock codes for military classifications now, but there was a lot of variation in how that was captured in our industry and occupation, whether it was their specific position or the branch of the military that we were in. So that might be something that will need to be addressed to improve the completeness of auto-coding. And then ultimately, the rates of violent death in North Carolina were highest in construction and maintenance occupations, and they differed by sex, age, and the urban-rural classification of the county of residence. And what this shows us is there's really a lot of opportunity to foster novel partnerships and work with groups and reach out to those groups to work around prevention and using these data to inform action. Scott, my mentor, mentioned maybe going out to Home Depot and working with some different groups to address suicide and homicide in the state. So that's all I have, and I guess we can do questions now.